The rifle shot echoed across the valley as Hank Keller watched another man die, this time by his own hand. The year was 1878, and death had become an old companion to the 30-year-old cowboy who'd spent the last decade running from his past and his heart. Standing over the body of the outlaw who'd tried to ambush him on the trail to Tahlequah, Oklahoma territory, Hank felt nothing but the familiar emptiness and the weight of another soul added to his conscience. "Shouldn't have drawn on me," he muttered, holstering his Colt revolver and adjusting his worn leather hat against the setting sun. His weathered face, tanned from years in the saddle, betrayed no emotion as he mounted his chestnut stallion. Love, Hank had learned long ago, was a luxury a man like him couldn't afford, not with the trail of graves he'd left behind. 3 days later, Hank rode into Tahlequah, a frontier town nestled in the foothills of the Ozark Mountains. The Cherokee Nation capital had grown since he'd last passed through, with new buildings lining the main street and more settlers mixing with the native inhabitants. After stabling his horse at the livery, Hank headed straight for the Frontier Saloon, his spurs jingling against the wooden boardwalk. The saloon was busy for a Wednesday evening. Hank found a quiet corner table with his back to the wall, an old habit that had kept him alive more than once. He ordered whiskey and a hot meal, planning to eat quickly and find a room for the night before continuing on to the cattle ranch where he'd been hired as a trail boss. "Another drifter." The voice was feminine, clear as a mountain stream, and carried just a hint of amusement. Hank looked up to find a woman in her mid-20s watching him from behind the bar. Her auburn hair was swept up in a practical style, a few curls escaping to frame a face that struck him as both delicate and determined. Unlike the saloon girls in their gaudy dresses, she wore a simple blue blouse and dark skirt. "Just passing through," Hank replied, tipping his hat slightly. "Madam." "That's what they all say," she said, bringing him a plate of stew. "Then half of them end up staying. I'm Abigail Kincaid. I own this establishment." Hank raised an eyebrow. "A woman running a saloon." "A woman running a saloon, a boarding house, and part interest in the stage line," she corrected, her green eyes challenging him to comment further. "And who might you be, cowboy?" "Hank Keller. Just took a job at the Double R Ranch." "Holden Russell's place." Abigail nodded. "Good man. Lost his trail boss last month to a bad fall. You've got experience, I take it?" 15 years in the saddle, 10 driving cattle," Hank said before taking a spoonful of stew. It was the best he'd tasted in months. "Well, Mr. Keller, welcome to Tahlequah." She smiled, and something in Hank's chest tightened uncomfortably. He looked back down at his plate. "Thanks for the meal, Miss Kincaid." "Abigail," she corrected. "Or Abby. Miss Kincaid makes me sound like a schoolmarm." When she walked away, Hank found himself watching her move through the crowded room with confidence, diffusing a potential argument between two ranch hands with a few well-chosen words and a disarming smile. There was something about her, something warm and alive, that made him uneasy. Hank finished his meal quickly, paid his bill, and headed for the door, needing fresh air and distance from the woman whose smile had somehow managed to slip beneath his carefully constructed armor. "Turning in so soon, Mr. Keller?" Abigail called after him. "Long ride tomorrow," he said without turning. "Good night, Miss Kincaid." "Abigail," she corrected again, but he was already through the door and into the night. The next morning, Hank rode out at dawn, eager to reach the Double R Ranch and begin work. The 15-mile ride gave him time to clear his head and bury thoughts of auburn hair and intelligent green eyes. Holden Russell was a gruff man in his 50s, with a weathered face and calloused hands that spoke of decades of hard work. He showed Hank the bunkhouse, introduced him to the hands, and outlined his expectations for the upcoming cattle drive to Kansas City. "Got 20 men for the drive, half of 'em green but willing to learn," Russell explained as they rode the property line. "Need to move 3,000 head before winter sets in. Think you can handle it?" "I've managed bigger herds with fewer men," Hank replied. "We'll get your cattle to market." "Good. I'll leave the details to you. Been hearing rumors of rustlers working the territory. Keep your eyes open." The next few weeks passed in a blur of work as Hank trained the inexperienced hands and prepared for the cattle drive. He rode into town only when necessary for supplies, deliberately avoiding the Frontier Saloon. Something about Abigail Kincaid unsettled him, awakened feelings he'd spent years burying beneath grief and guilt. 3 weeks after arriving in Tahlequah, Hank found himself in town again, delivering a message to the telegraph office for Russell. As he walked back toward the livery, a woman's scream cut through the afternoon quiet. Without thinking, Hank ran toward the sound, rounding the corner to find 2 men dragging a struggling Abigail toward an alley. His Colt was in his hand before he consciously drew it. "Let her go," he commanded, his voice deadly calm. The men turned, one still gripping Abigail's arm while the other reached for his pistol. Hank fired once, the bullet kicking up dirt at the man's feet. "Next one goes through your knee," Hank warned. "Let her go." The would-be attacker dropped his hand from his gun, and his companion released Abigail, who immediately stepped away from them. "We was just having some fun," the taller man protested. "Ain't no need for shooting." "Your idea of fun ends now," Hank said. "Get out of town before sundown, or I'll let the sheriff decide what to do with you." The men backed away, then turned and hurried down the street. Hank holstered his weapon and turned to Abigail. "Are you hurt?" he asked, noting her torn sleeve and the red mark on her cheek. "Nothing serious," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Keller. You seem to have a talent for appearing when needed." Hank nodded awkwardly. "Let me walk you back to the saloon." They walked in silence for a moment before Abigail spoke again. "I haven't seen you in town much. Holden working you too hard." "Been busy getting ready for the drive," Hank replied. "Leaving in 2 days." "So soon?" Something in her voice made him glance at her, but her expression revealed nothing. "How long will you be gone?" "6 weeks, give or take." They reached the saloon, and Abigail paused at the door. "Would you come in for a drink?" "On the house. A thank you for your timely rescue." Hank knew he should refuse, should tip his hat and walk away. Instead, he found himself following her inside, taking a seat at a quiet corner table while she brought 2 glasses and a bottle of good whiskey. "I don't make a habit of drinking with customers," she said, pouring them each a measure, "but I think today calls for an exception." "Those men, do you know them?" Hank asked. "New in town," Abigail replied. "Been causing trouble since they arrived. Sheriff's been watching them, but they caught me unaware." She took a sip of whiskey. "I should know better than to take shortcuts down empty alleys." "Even in a town like this," Hank agreed. They sat in surprisingly comfortable silence for a moment before Abigail spoke again. "You're not much for conversation, are you, Mr. Keller?" "Hank," he corrected, surprising himself. "And no, I suppose I'm not." "A man of few words and many secrets," she observed. "I can respect that. We all have pasts we'd rather not discuss." Something in her tone made him look up, meeting her gaze. There was understanding there, not judgment or pity, and it caught him off guard. "What brought you to Tahlequah, Abigail?" he asked. "A chance to start over," she replied simply. "My husband died 3 years ago. Influenza. He left debts I couldn't pay in St. Louis, so I came west with what little I had left. Bought this place when the previous owner died without heirs." She smiled faintly. "People were scandalized at first, a woman running a saloon. But they've gotten used to me." "I imagine they have," Hank said, finding himself smiling slightly in return. They talked for nearly an hour, Abigail sharing stories of the town and its characters, while Hank offered brief anecdotes from his years on the trail. When he finally stood to leave, he was surprised at how quickly the time had passed. "Thank you for the drink," he said, placing his hat back on his head. "Thank you for the rescue," she replied. "Be careful on that cattle drive, Hank. I'd hate to have to find a new favorite customer." He nodded, uncomfortable with the warmth her words stirred. "Good day, Abigail." As he walked back to the ranch, Hank couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them, or perhaps within him. It was dangerous territory, this tentative connection. He'd learned the hard way that people close to him ended up dead. The cattle drive began 2 days later at dawn, 3,000 head of cattle stretching out across the prairie, 20 cowboys and Hank at the lead. The work was hard but familiar, the days long and dusty, the nights cold and brief. They made good progress, averaging 15 miles a day in fair weather. 2 weeks into the drive, disaster struck. A sudden summer storm rolled in after dark, lightning splitting the night sky and thunder sending the cattle into a panic. The resulting stampede killed 2 cowboys and scattered nearly 1,000 head across miles of prairie. It took 3 days to round up most of the strays, and Hank had to make the difficult decision to leave the rest behind. They buried their dead, simple wooden crosses marking graves that would be anonymous within a year, washed away by prairie winds and rain. That night, sitting alone by the campfire after the others had turned in, Hank pulled a battered tin type from his saddlebag, the only personal possession he carried. In the flickering firelight, 3 faces looked back at him. A younger version of himself, a dark-haired woman with a gentle smile, and a boy of about 5 with his mother's eyes and his father's determined jaw. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he whispered to the image of his wife, dead these 8 years. "I'm sorry, Thomas." His son would have been 13 now had he lived. Memories washed over him, memories he usually kept at bay with work and whiskey. The small farm in Kansas, the drought that drove them west to Colorado, the Cheyenne raid that had taken his family while he was in town trading furs, coming home to find nothing but ashes and bodies. For 3 years after, he'd hunted the war party responsible, killing 7 men before a Cheyenne elder had confronted him, explaining that the raid had been conducted by renegades acting against tribal orders, that they had already been punished by their own people for attacking settlers during peace negotiations. The revelation had broken something in Hank. Without vengeance to drive him, he drifted, taking whatever work would keep him in the saddle and away from anything resembling a home. He'd learned that caring for people meant watching them die. Better to keep moving, keep his distance. But now, images of auburn hair and green eyes intruded on his memories. Abigail Kincaid had somehow wormed her way into his thoughts during the long days in the saddle. Her smile, her strength, the way she'd built a life for herself after losing everything, it resonated with something deep within him, something he'd thought long dead. "It doesn't matter," he told himself aloud. "She's just another person in another town I'll leave behind." The remainder of the drive passed without major incident. They reached Kansas City in good time, the cattle brought fair prices, and Russell would be pleased with the results. Hank paid the men, saw them safely lodged in town, and began the long journey back to Tahlequah, riding alone as was his preference. The return trip gave him too much time to think. He considered not returning to the Double R at all. It would be simple enough to head south to Texas or west to New Mexico, find work with another outfit. But Russell had been fair, and the job offered stability through the winter. And if something else pulled him back to Tahlequah, something with auburn hair and a ready smile, he refused to acknowledge it. It was late afternoon when Hank rode into town 6 weeks after leaving. He headed first to the bank to deposit Russell's money, then to the telegraph office to send word of his arrival. Only then, with his duties discharged, did he allow himself to walk toward the Frontier Saloon. The place was busy, the evening crowd just beginning to gather. Hank hesitated at the door, suddenly uncertain of his welcome after so long away. Before he could decide whether to enter, the door swung open and Abigail herself stood there, a basket of supplies in her arms. "Hank!" The surprise and pleasure in her voice sent an unexpected warmth through him. "You're back." "Just rode in," he said, taking the basket from her automatically. "Successful drive?" she asked, leading him around to the back entrance of the saloon. "Lost 2 men to a stampede," he replied, the memory still fresh. "But got most of the cattle to market at good prices." Abigail stopped, turning to face him fully. "I'm sorry about your men. Were they friends?" "Just hands," Hank said, then immediately regretted the callousness of his words. "Good men, though, young," she nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Come inside. You look like you could use a hot meal and a drink." The back entrance led to a small private dining room adjacent to the kitchen. Abigail took the basket from him and gave instructions to her cook, before gesturing for Hank to sit. "I usually take my meals here when the saloon is busy," she explained. "You're welcome to join me." Hank should have made an excuse, should have left and reported to Russell as duty demanded. Instead, he removed his hat and sat across from her at the small table. "The town's been quiet since you left," Abigail said as the cook brought out plates of roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread. "Those 2 troublemakers you ran off never came back. Sheriff caught a bank robber last month. Oh, and Mrs. Peterson finally had her baby a boy after 5 girls." Hank found himself smiling at her animated descriptions of town life. He ate slowly, savoring both the excellent food and her company, offering brief accounts of the cattle drive when she asked. "Will you stay through winter?" Abigail asked as they finished the meal. "At the Double R, I mean." "Russell offered steady work," Hank replied. "Makes sense to stay until spring." "I'm glad," she said simply, then rose as the sounds from the main room grew louder. "I should get back to work. You're welcome to stay, of course." "Thank you for the meal," Hank said, standing and placing his hat back on his head. "I should report to Russell." "Of course." Was that disappointment in her voice? "Will I see you again soon?" Hank hesitated, knowing the wise answer was to keep his distance. "I expect so," he said instead. The smile that lit her face stayed with him all the way back to the ranch. Over the next few weeks, Hank found himself in town more often than necessary. He told himself it was for supplies, or to deliver messages for Russell, or to check on trail conditions. But each visit inevitably led him to the Frontier Saloon, to a corner table where he could watch Abigail work, and when she had a moment, enjoy her company. They developed a comfortable routine. Hank would come in, Abigail would bring him a drink and sit with him when she could, and they would talk or often just sit in companionable silence. Sometimes she would ask him to escort her on errands around town, and he found himself unable to refuse. Rumors began to circulate among the townspeople, speculation about the relationship between the saloon owner and the quiet cowboy. Hank heard the whispers but ignored them. There was nothing to the rumors, he told himself. They were friends, nothing more. But as autumn painted the Ozarks in vibrant reds and golds, Hank became increasingly aware of how Abigail had become a fixed point in his wandering existence. He looked forward to seeing her, found himself thinking of things to tell her when they next met, Notice the way sunlight caught in her hair or how her eyes crinkled at the corners when she laughed. It was dangerous territory, and Hank knew he should pull back. But he couldn't bring himself to stay away. The first snow fell in early November, dusting Tahlequah in white and keeping Hank at the ranch for nearly a week as they prepared the herd for winter. When he finally made it to town, the streets were muddy from melting snow, the air crisp with the promise of more to come. The saloon was quieter than usual, most patrons choosing to stay home on such a cold evening. Hank stamped snow from his boots and nodded to the few regulars before taking his usual table. When Abigail brought his whiskey, her smile seemed brighter than the lanterns warming the room. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten the way to town," she teased, sitting across from him. "Been busy with winter preparations," Hank replied. "How have you been?" "Well enough. Business is slower with the cold weather, but it gives me time to catch up on bookkeeping." She studied him for a moment. "You look tired." "Long days," he admitted. "Russell's got us cutting extra firewood, reinforcing the barns, moving the herd to sheltered pastures." "Will you be in town for the Harvest Festival next week?" Abigail asked. "The whole town turns out. There's music, dancing, plenty of food." "Don't much care for crowds," Hank said, though the real reason for his hesitation was the thought of watching Abigail dance with other men. "I understand," she said, disappointment evident in her voice. "It's just, well, I had hoped you might escort me." Hank looked up, surprised. "You want me to take you to the festival? Is that so hard to believe?" Abigail asked, a hint of challenge in her tone. "You could have your pick of men in this town," Hank pointed out, "and yet I'm asking you." She held his gaze steadily. "But if you'd rather not—" "I didn't say that," Hank interrupted. I'm not much for dancing." "Neither am I," she confessed with a small laugh. "My late husband always said I had 2 left feet, but I enjoy the music and the company would be welcome." Hank knew he should refuse. Getting closer to Abigail was a mistake he couldn't afford to make, but the hope in her eyes undid his resolve. "What time should I pick you up?" he asked, and was rewarded with a smile that warmed him more than the whiskey. "The festival starts at sundown," she said, "but come for supper first." "I'll close the saloon early that night." After she left to tend to other customers, Hank sat nursing his drink and wondering what he'd gotten himself into. He hadn't courted a woman since Sarah, hadn't even considered the possibility. Yet here he was, agreeing to escort Abigail to a town gathering as if he were a normal man with a normal future, not a drifter with blood on his hands and ghosts at his back. The night of the festival arrived cold and clear, stars brilliant in the dark sky above Tahlequah. Hank spent more time than usual on his appearance, shaving carefully, putting on his one good shirt, and even borrowing boot polish from one of the other hands. He rode into town early, securing his horse at the livery before walking to the rear entrance of the saloon as Abigail had instructed. She opened the door at his knock, and the sight of her momentarily stole his breath. Her auburn hair fell in loose curls around her shoulders, and she wore a dark green dress that brought out the color of her eyes. A simple gold locket was her only jewelry. "You look nice," Hank managed, the words inadequate to his thoughts. "Thank you," Abigail replied, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "So do you. Please come in." She had prepared a simple but delicious meal, and they ate in the private dining room, talking easily about the ranch, the town, and the coming winter. Hank found himself relaxing in her presence, sharing stories he hadn't told anyone in years, tales of cattle drives and frontier towns, adventures and misadventures on the trail. "How did you become a cowboy?" Abigail asked as they finished their meal. "Were you raised on a ranch?" "No," Hank replied, the question bringing him back to memories he usually avoided. "I was a farmer originally, in Kansas, Had a small place wheat, mostly some livestock. What changed? She asked, clearly sensing there was more to the story. Hank hesitated, then decided on a partial truth. Lost the farm in a drought. Needed work and I was good with horses. Started as a ranch hand, worked my way up. Abigail nodded, accepting his explanation without pressing for more. Life has a way of taking unexpected turns, she said. I never imagined I'd own a saloon, but here we are. As they walked to the town square where the festival was being held, Hank offered Abigail his arm. She took it with a smile, and he was acutely aware of her closeness, the light scent of lavender that surrounded her. The square had been transformed for the occasion. Lanterns hung from trees and poles, casting a warm glow over tables laden with food. A group of musicians played lively tunes on a small platform, and couples already danced in the cleared area before them. Townsfolk of all ages mingled, children darting between groups of adults, old men playing checkers at corner tables. Many people greeted Abigail warmly, though Hank noticed a few disapproving glances from some of the older women. His protective instincts flared at their obvious judgment of her profession. "Don't mind Mrs. Tanner and her friends," Abigail said, noting his tension. "They disapprove of any woman who manages without a husband, especially one who serves alcohol." "Their loss," Hank said, surprising himself with the sentiment. "You've built something to be proud of." Her grateful smile was worth the discomfort of the social gathering. They made their way through the crowd, stopping to sample food and exchange pleasantries with people Abigail knew. Hank was introduced to so many townspeople he lost track of names, but he noted the respect with which most treated Abigail despite her unconventional position. As the evening progressed, the music slowed, and more couples took to the dancing area. Hank watched Abigail's foot tapping in time to the music and knew what she wanted even before she looked at him hopefully. "I warned you I'm not much of a dancer," he said, but he was already standing and offering his hand. "And I told you I have 2 left feet," she reminded him with a laugh. "We'll stumble together." They moved to the edge of the dancing area, and Hank awkwardly placed his hand at her waist while taking her other hand in his. It had been so long since he'd held a woman this way that he felt stiff and uncertain. "Relax," Abigail murmured, stepping closer. "It's just me." That was precisely the problem, Hank thought. It was Abigail, the woman who had somehow slipped past his defenses, who made him want things he'd sworn never to want again. But as they began to move to the music, his body remembered the steps his mind had forgotten. They weren't graceful, but neither did they stumble as badly as Abigail had predicted. By the second dance, Hank found himself enjoying the simple pleasure of holding her, moving with her, being part of something normal and good. "See, not so terrible," Abigail said as the song ended. "Not at all," Hank agreed, reluctant to release her. The moment was interrupted by a commotion at the edge of the square. Raised voices carried over the music, followed by the unmistakable sound of a fist connecting with flesh. Hank instinctively moved Abigail behind him, scanning the crowd for the source of the disturbance. A group of cowboys not from the Double R, but a neighboring ranch had apparently been drinking heavily before arriving at the festival. One was now engaged in a fistfight with a local shopkeeper while his companions egged him on. "Stay here," Hank told Abigail, moving toward the fight. Other men were already intervening, including Sheriff Davis, a sturdy man in his 40s who had welcomed Hank to town months ago. The situation seemed under control until one of the drunken cowboys pulled a gun. People scattered, women screaming and children being hustled to safety. The sheriff had his own weapon out, but the crowded square made it a dangerous standoff. "Put it down, son," Davis ordered. "Nobody needs to get hurt tonight." "This ain't none of your business, Sheriff," the cowboy slurred, waving his pistol unsteadily. "Just between me and Thompson here." Hank moved quietly through the edge of the crowd, coming up behind the armed man. In one swift motion, he disarmed him, twisting the gun from his hand and shoving him forward into the sheriff's waiting grip. "Nicely done, Keller," Davis said, cuffing the stunned cowboy. "You boys are spending the night in my jail," he told the group. "Holden Russell will hear about this tomorrow." As the sheriff and his deputy led the troublemakers away, the crowd slowly relaxed. The musicians tentatively began playing again, and people drifted back to their celebrations, the excitement providing fresh fodder for conversation. Hank returned to where he'd left Abigail, only to find her gone. A moment of panic seized him until he spotted her at the far edge of the square, helping a mother comfort a frightened child. He watched as she knelt beside the little girl, speaking softly until the child's tears stopped and a small smile appeared. Something twisted in Hank's chest at the sight, a longing so intense it was almost painful. In another life, Abigail might have been comforting their child. In another life, he might have been worthy of the tenderness she showed so freely. But not in this life. Not with his past. When Abigail rejoined him, her face was flushed with concern. "That could have ended badly," she said. "Thank you for stepping in." "Sheriff had it under control," Hank replied, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Still, you acted without hesitation." She studied his face. "You've done that before." It wasn't quite a question, but Hank felt compelled to answer. "Been in a few scrapes. More than a few, I'd wager." Abigail glanced around at the festival, which was returning to its former cheer. "Would you mind if we left? I find I'm not in a celebrating mood anymore." "Of course," Hank agreed, relieved at the suggestion. The confrontation had left him on edge, too aware of how quickly violence could erupt and lives could change. They walked back to the saloon in comfortable silence, Abigail's hand resting lightly on Hank's arm. The town was quiet, most residents still at the festival, and their footsteps echoed on the wooden boardwalks. At the door to her quarters behind the saloon, Abigail turned to face him. "Thank you for tonight," she said. "Despite the excitement at the end, I enjoyed myself more than I have in a long time." "So did I," Hank admitted. It was the truth. For a few hours, he'd allowed himself to forget the past and simply enjoy the present, enjoy her company. Abigail hesitated, then stepped closer, resting her hand lightly on his chest. "Hank," she said softly, "I know you keep people at a distance. I respect that. But I want you to know that I care for you more than I should, perhaps, and certainly more than is wise for a woman in my position." Hank stood frozen, her words both a gift and a warning. He should step back, tip his hat, and walk away. Instead, he found himself covering her hand with his own. "Abigail," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "You deserve better than—" "Don't," she interrupted. "Don't tell me what I deserve. I've had enough of people deciding that for me." Her green eyes held his, unwavering. "I know who you are, Hank Keller. I see the man beneath the silence and the distance, and I'm telling you that I care for that man." Before he could respond, she rose on her toes and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. "Good night, Hank," she whispered, then disappeared inside, leaving him standing alone in the cold night, his thoughts in turmoil. The ride back to the ranch gave Hank too much time to think. Abigail's kiss burned on his cheek, her words echoed in his mind. She cared for him. Against all reason, against his best efforts to keep her at arm's length, she had developed feelings for him. And God help him, he felt the same. The realization struck him like a physical blow. Somewhere between that first meal and tonight's dance, Abigail Kincaid had become essential to him. Her smile, her strength, her kindness, they had awakened something he'd thought long dead. He cared for her. Perhaps he even loved her, and that meant she was in danger. Everyone Hank had ever loved had died. His parents to fever when he was young, his wife and son to violence. Even fellow cowboys who'd become friends had met untimely ends. The two men lost on the cattle drive were just the latest examples. Hank Keller was a cursed man. He wouldn't bring that curse to Abigail's door. For the next 2 weeks, Hank avoided town entirely. He threw himself into ranch work, volunteering for the most distant and difficult tasks, riding fence lines in bitter cold, checking on isolated herds in snowy meadows. At night, exhausted, he would fall into his bunk in the ranch house, only to dream of auburn hair and green eyes. His fellow hands noticed the change in him. Cooper, an old-timer who'd been with Russell for years, finally confronted him one evening as they repaired tack in the warmth of the barn. "Woman trouble?" the older man asked bluntly, not looking up from the saddle he was mending. Hank grunted noncommittally. "Figured as much," Cooper continued. "Heard you been keeping company with the Kincaid woman. Proper lady from what I hear, despite her business." "She is," Hank agreed, then fell silent again. Cooper waited, continuing his work, apparently content to let the silence stretch. Finally, Hank spoke again. "People I care about tend to die," he said, the words escaping before he could stop them. Cooper nodded slowly. "Lost your family, did you?" Hank looked up sharply. "What do you know about it?" "Nothing specific," the older man replied. "But I recognize the look. Had it myself after my wife and boy died of typhoid back in '63. He set aside his work and met Hank's gaze directly. "Took me 10 years to stop blaming myself. Another 5 to realize I was dishonoring their memory by refusing to live." Hank looked away, uncomfortable with the man's insight. "It's different, always is," Cooper agreed easily. "But the fear's the same. Fear of caring again. Fear of losing again." He picked up his tools and resumed working. "Just remember, son, the dead stay dead whether we mourn or celebrate, whether we love again or die alone. They don't care. Only the living care." The old cowboy's words followed Hank for days, mingling with memories of Abigail's touch, her declaration of feelings, her kiss. He found himself riding closer to town each day, though he never quite reached its limits. Finally, a week before Christmas, Russell asked him to deliver a package to the general store in Tahlequah. "And stop by the saloon," the rancher added casually. "Miss Kincaid's been asking after you." Hank's heart skipped at the words. "She has. Every time I've been in town," Russell confirmed. "Seems concerned. I told her you were fine, just busy, but I don't think she believed me." Hank nodded, torn between anticipation and dread at seeing Abigail again. "I'll look in on her." The town was decorated for Christmas, evergreen boughs and red ribbons adorning the buildings along the main street. Fresh snow from the night before made everything look clean and bright in the winter sunlight. After delivering Russell's package, Hank stood outside the Frontier Saloon, gathering his courage. Inside, the saloon was warm and welcoming, a fire blazing in the hearth, the smell of pine and cinnamon in the air. Several customers looked up as Hank entered, but his eyes sought only one person. Abigail stood behind the bar, deep in conversation with a well-dressed man Hank didn't recognize. She laughed at something the stranger said, and jealousy flared unexpectedly in Hank's chest. He almost turned to leave, but then Abigail glanced up and saw him. The smile that lit her face erased all his doubts. She excused herself from the conversation and walked quickly toward him, stopping just short of throwing her arms around him. "Hank," she said, her voice a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "It's good to see you." "You too," he replied inadequately. "I've been busy, I know," she finished for him. "Holden told me." An awkward silence fell between them, weeks of absence and unspoken feelings creating a barrier that hadn't existed before. "Would you like a drink?" Abigail finally asked. "Or some coffee?" "It's bitter cold out there. Coffee would be welcome," Hank said, following her to a table near the fire. She brought 2 cups and sat across from him, her eyes searching his face. "I thought perhaps I'd scared you off," she said directly, "after what I said that night." Hank looked down at his coffee, gathering his thoughts. When he looked up again, his decision was made. Cooper was right, the dead stayed dead regardless of what the living did, and Hank was tired of half living. "You didn't scare me," he said quietly. "I scared myself." Abigail waited, giving him space to continue. "I was married once," Hank began, the words difficult after so many years of silence. "Had a son. They died 8 years ago." Understanding dawned in Abigail's eyes. "I'm so sorry, Hank." "After they were gone, I swore I'd never care for anyone again," he continued. "It hurt too much to lose them, and it seemed like anyone I got close to ended up dead, like I was cursed somehow. And then we met," Abigail said softly. Hank nodded. "And then we met. And no matter how hard I tried not to care, I couldn't stop myself." He met her gaze directly. "I care for you, Abigail, more than I've cared for anyone since Sarah died, and it terrifies me." Abigail reached across the table and took his hand in hers. "I understand fear, Hank. After James died, I was certain I'd never love again. Not because I was afraid of loss, but because I didn't think I deserved happiness after failing him." "How did you fail him?" Hank asked, surprised. "I couldn't save him," she replied simply. "I tried everything, doctors, medicines, prayers. Nothing worked. I watched him waste away and couldn't stop it. And afterward I blamed myself for not doing more, not knowing more, not being enough." Hank squeezed her hand, recognizing her guilt as a reflection of his own. "It wasn't your fault. Nor was your family's death yours," she countered gently. "Yet here we are, both afraid to reach for happiness because of ghosts that haunt us." Her insight struck Hank silent. Was that what he'd been doing? Punishing himself for surviving when they hadn't? "I don't know if I can be what you need," he finally said. "I've been alone a long time. I'm not good with words, with feelings." "I'm not asking for pretty words or grand gestures," Abigail replied. "Just for you to stop running, to give whatever this is between us a chance." Hank looked at their joined hands, then back at her face, so open and honest in the firelight. "And if it doesn't work, if I can't change, then I'll wait until you can," she said simply. "I believe in you, Hank Keller, even when you don't believe in yourself." Her faith in him was humbling, undeserved but desperately welcome. Hank felt something shift inside him, a loosening of the tight bands that had constricted his heart for so long. "I can't promise I won't make mistakes," he warned, "or that the past won't sometimes get the better of me." "I'm not asking for perfection," Abigail assured him. "Just presence, just effort." Hank nodded slowly. "I can try," he said, the words a vow. Abigail's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "That's all anyone can do." The weeks that followed were a revelation for Hank. He began coming to town regularly again, sometimes just for an hour to share a meal with Abigail, sometimes for an entire evening. They established a routine Sunday dinners in her private dining room, Wednesday afternoons running errands together around town, occasional evenings by the fire after the saloon closed. They talked more openly now, sharing pieces of their pasts, building trust one conversation at a time. Hank told her about his farm in Kansas, about Sarah's love of gardening and Thomas's knack with animals. Abigail spoke of her childhood in St. Louis, her whirlwind courtship with James, their dreams of starting a family before illness claimed him. Christmas came and went, the town celebration made brighter for Hank by Abigail's presence at his side. He gave her a simple silver bracelet he'd commissioned from a Cherokee silversmith, while she presented him with a finely crafted leather journal. "For your thoughts," she explained, "when you can't say them aloud." The gift touched him deeply. She understood his struggles with expression, and instead of demanding he change, she offered a bridge. As winter deepened, their relationship grew warmer. Their first real kiss came on a snowy January evening, after Hank had helped Abigail close the saloon during a blizzard. It was gentle, tentative, both of them uncertain after years of solitude. But it kindled a flame that burned steadily brighter in the weeks that followed. By February, Tahlequah buzzed with gossip about the saloon owner and the quiet cowboy from the Double R. Some approved, noting how Hank had calmed since his arrival in town, how Abigail smiled more readily. Others predicted disaster, pointing to Hank's drifter past and Abigail's unconventional position. Neither Hank nor Abigail paid much attention to the talk. They were too focused on the delicate, wonderful thing growing between them, a connection neither had expected to find again. But as spring approached and plans for the next cattle drive began taking shape, Hank faced a crossroads. Russell expected him to lead the drive to Kansas City again, a journey that would take him away from Tahlequah, away from Abigail for nearly 2 months. "Will you come back?" Abigail asked the night he told her about the drive. They sat before the fireplace in her private quarters, Hank in an armchair, Abigail on the floor leaning against his legs. "Of course," Hank replied, surprised by the question. "Why wouldn't I?" She turned to look up at him, vulnerability clear in her eyes. "Because the trail might remind you how much you enjoy the freedom of the open range, because you might remember you're a drifter at heart." Hank reached down to touch her cheek. "I've drifted enough," he said quietly. "Found what I didn't know I was looking for." She leaned into his touch. "Promise me," she whispered. "I promise," he said, and meant it. The cattle drive began in early April, the herd smaller than the previous year but still substantial. Hank led 15 cowboys and 3,000 head of cattle eastward through the greening prairie. The work was as hard as ever, but this time, letters followed him along the trail. At each town with a post office, messages from Abigail waited, full of news from Tahlequah and tender words that warmed the cold nights. Hank wrote back when he could, his words awkward at first but growing more confident with practice. He described the trail, the men, the challenges they faced. But more importantly, he shared his feelings, his anticipation of seeing her again, his growing certainty that his future lay with her in Tahlequah. The drive went smoothly until they were 3 weeks in, just crossing into Missouri. A band of rustlers attacked at night, stampeding a portion of the herd and wounding 2 of Hank's men. They recovered most of the cattle, but the incident delayed them by several days and left everyone on edge. A week later, as they made camp near a small settlement, a young cowboy rode in with news from Tahlequah. Russell's daughter had fallen seriously ill, and the rancher was requesting Hank's return. The experienced hand Cooper would take over the drive. Hank was torn between duty to Russell and responsibility to the men and cattle under his care, but Cooper assured him the drive was in good hands. "Go on, son," the older man said. "Family comes first." The word struck Hank with unexpected force. Family. He hadn't thought of himself as having family in nearly a decade. But Russell had become something of a father figure, and Abigail. Abigail was becoming everything. Hank rode hard, covering the distance back to Tahlequah in half the time it would normally take. He stopped only when necessary to rest his horse, pushing himself beyond exhaustion. When he finally reached the Double R, he found Russell's daughter recovering under the care of the town doctor and her relieved father. The crisis had passed, but Russell was grateful for Hank's swift return. "Figured you'd want to know about another situation in town," Russell said after thanking him. There's been trouble at the frontier. Hank's blood ran cold. What kind of trouble? Group of men came through last week, Russell explained. Rough sorts. Been causing problems all over town, but seemed to have taken a particular dislike to Miss Kincaid's establishment. Sheriff ran them off once, but they came back. Broke some windows, threatened her customers. Hank was already heading for the door. Is she all right? Far as I know, Russell called after him. Sheriff's been keeping an eye out, but those men are still in the area. Hank rode into town at a gallop, fear driving him harder than exhaustion. The main street was quiet in the late afternoon sun, no sign of trouble. The Frontier Saloon stood as always, though Hank noticed the new glass in 2 front windows. He burst through the door, scanning the room frantically until he spotted Abigail behind the bar, looking up in surprise at his dramatic entrance. "Hank!" she exclaimed, coming around the bar quickly. "What are you doing here?" The drive, he crossed the room in long strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as relief flooded through him. "Are you all right?" he demanded, drawing back to examine her face. "Russell said there's been trouble." "I'm fine," she assured him, though he noticed a fading bruise on her cheek that made his jaw clench. "Just some rowdy drifters. Sheriff Davis has been keeping watch." "What happened to your face?" Hank asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Abigail touched the bruise self-consciously. "One of them got a little too familiar," I objected. "He didn't take it well." Fury surged through Hank. "Where are they now?" "Hank, don't," Abigail said, recognizing his intent. "The sheriff, where?" he repeated. "They've been camping at the old Miller place outside town," she reluctantly answered. "But please, let the law handle this. I don't want you getting hurt because of me." Hank cupped her face gently in his calloused hands. "No one hurts what's mine," he said, the possessive words escaping before he could consider them. Instead of objecting, Abigail covered his hands with hers. "And no one hurts what's mine," she countered. "Which is why I'm asking you not to confront them alone. Please, Hank. I've already lost one man I loved. I couldn't bear to lose another." The word hung between them, loved. Hank stared at her, his anger temporarily forgotten in the face of her admission. "You love me?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Of course I do," Abigail replied simply. "I thought you knew." Hank shook his head slowly. "I hoped," he admitted, "but I wasn't sure I deserved it." "Love isn't about deserving," she said. "It's about choosing. And I choose you, Hank Keller, difficulties and all." He drew her close again, overcome. After a moment, he pulled back just enough to meet her gaze. "I love you too," he said, the words easier than he'd expected. "Have for months now, maybe since that first meal you served me." Her smile was radiant. "Then trust me now, don't go after those men alone. Let's talk to Sheriff Davis together. Please." For her, Hank would try. He nodded agreement, though his blood still boiled at the thought of anyone laying hands on her. They found Sheriff Davis at his office, reviewing wanted posters. He looked up in surprise at Hank's entrance. "Keller. Thought you were on the drive to Kansas City." "Came back early," Hank replied tersely. "Heard there's been trouble with Miss Kincaid." Davis sighed, setting aside his papers. "Bunch of no accounts passing through, been causing problems all over the county. Ran them off twice now, but they keep coming back." He eyed Hank speculatively. "You thinking of taking matters into your own hands?" "Considering it," Hank admitted. "Well, don't," the sheriff advised. "I'm organizing a proper posse tomorrow. Turns out their leader, fella named Brock, is wanted in Arkansas for murder. Got the paper just today." He tapped a wanted poster on his desk. "You're welcome to join us, but we're doing this legal-like. Understand?" Hank nodded reluctantly. "Tomorrow, then." 8 o'clock sharp, Davis confirmed. As they left the sheriff's office, Abigail squeezed Hank's hand gratefully. "Thank you for listening." "Don't thank me yet," Hank warned. If they show their faces in town tonight, all bets are off. But the troublemakers stayed away, and the evening passed peacefully. Hank remained at the saloon until closing, then walked Abigail to her quarters. "Stay with me tonight," she said softly as they reached her door. "Just to sleep," she added quickly, seeing his surprise. "I've missed you, and after everything that's happened." Hank hesitated, old boundaries warring with new feelings. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more certain of anything," Abigail replied. Inside her small but comfortable apartment behind the saloon, they shared a simple meal and talked late into the night. Hank told her about the cattle drive, the rustlers, Russell's daughter. Abigail filled him in on town happenings during his absence. When exhaustion finally overtook them, they lay together in her bed, Hank holding Abigail close as if to assure himself she was safe. Sleep claimed him quickly, the first peaceful rest he'd had in weeks. Morning brought clarity and purpose. Hank rose early, dressed quietly, and left a note for the still sleeping Abigail. He promised to return after helping the sheriff, asked her to stay in town where it was safe, and ended with 3 words that had once seemed impossible: "I love you." 8 men gathered at the sheriff's office that morning, including Russell, who had ridden in specifically to join the posse. Davis outlined their plan. They would ride to the old Miller place, surround it, and demand Brock and his men surrender. If they resisted, the posse was authorized to use force. "We're after Brock particularly," Davis emphasized. "The rest are small-time troublemakers. If they surrender peaceful-like, we'll just escort them to the county line." "Understood." The posse nodded agreement, though Hank privately doubted Brock's men would go quietly after their leader was arrested. The old Miller farm lay 3 miles outside town, the house and barn long abandoned after the owner died without heirs. As they approached, smoke from a campfire was visible behind the barn. Davis motioned for the men to spread out and surround the property. Hank took position near the corral, rifle ready, watching as the sheriff and Russell approached the barn directly. 4 men sat around the morning fire, a 5th emerging from the barn at the sound of the approaching horses. "Brock," Davis called out. "You're wanted for murder in the state of Arkansas. I'm placing you under arrest. Tell your men to stand down." The man from the barn, a tall, scar-faced individual with cold eyes, reached for his gun. "I don't think so, Sheriff." Shots erupted as Brock and his men went for their weapons. The posse returned fire, and chaos engulfed the farmyard. Hank took aim at one of the men trying to reach the horses, his shot finding its mark in the man's shoulder. The firefight was brief but intense. When it ended, Brock lay dead. 2 of his men were wounded, and the remaining 2 had surrendered. One member of the posse, a young store clerk named Williams, had taken a bullet in the leg but would recover. "Damn fool," Russell muttered, standing over Brock's body. "Could have come peacefully." "Men like that don't know how to live peacefully," Hank replied, thinking of the bruise on Abigail's cheek. They returned to town with the prisoners and the wounded, a solemn procession that drew onlookers from homes and businesses along the main street. Abigail stood outside the saloon, relief washing over her face as she spotted Hank riding unharmed with the others. After seeing the wounded Williams to the doctor and the prisoners secured in the jail, Hank made his way to Abigail. She met him halfway, not caring who saw, as she embraced him tightly. "You're safe," she breathed against his chest. "Promised I would be," he reminded her, kissing the top of her head. "Is it over?" she asked, drawing back to search his face. "It's over," Hank confirmed. "Brock's dead. His men will stand trial or leave the territory, depending on what the judge decides." Abigail nodded, then surprised him by taking his hand and leading him toward the center of the street. "Then there's something I need to say, and I want witnesses." Puzzled, Hank followed her. Several townspeople still lingered nearby, including Russell, Cooper, who had returned from the cattle drive the previous day, and Sheriff Davis. Abigail faced Hank squarely, still holding his hands, her voice clear enough to carry to those around them. "Hank Keller, when we met, you were a cowboy who feared love. I told you then I would wait until you didn't." She smiled, tears shimmering in her green eyes. "I don't want to wait anymore. I love you and I want to spend my life with you. Will you marry me?" Hank stared at her, stunned by her public declaration and proposal. Behind them, he vaguely registered gasps and murmurs from the onlookers. But all he could see was Abigail Brave, beautiful Abigail offering him everything he'd convinced himself he could never have again. "Yes," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." A cheer went up from the gathered crowd as Hank pulled Abigail into his arms, kissing her thoroughly without regard for their audience. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Cooper's voice rose above the others. "About damn time, Keller." The wedding took place 2 weeks later, a simple ceremony in the town church followed by a celebration at the Frontier Saloon that lasted well into the night. Abigail wore a cream-colored dress with lace at the collar and cuffs, her auburn hair adorned with wildflowers. Hank, uncomfortable in his best suit but unwilling to disappoint his bride, stood proudly beside her as they exchanged vows. Russell gave the bride away. Cooper stood as Hank's best man, and it seemed the entire town turned out to witness the union of the saloon owner and the cowboy who had finally opened his heart. As they danced together that evening, surrounded by well-wishers, Hank held Abigail close and marveled at how his life had changed in less than a year. "What are you thinking?" Abigail asked, noting his thoughtful expression. "That I'm the luckiest man alive," he replied honestly. "And that I wasted too many years being afraid." "Not wasted," she corrected gently. "You needed that time to be ready for this for us, and I needed mine." Hank nodded, understanding her wisdom. "Then I'm grateful the waiting's over." "As am I, husband," Abigail said, the word new and wonderful between them. Later that night, as they lay together in what was now their shared bed, plans for the future took shape. Hank would continue working at the Double R, but they agreed he would find a replacement to lead the cattle drives. Abigail would keep the saloon for now, though they discussed possibly selling it eventually to start a different business together. "Maybe a hotel," Abigail suggested. "Talek was growing. We could build something respectable, something that would welcome families." "Whatever you want," Hank agreed, content to follow her lead in this as in so many things. "What I want," she said, turning in his arms to face him, "is a family of our own, children, a home filled with love and laughter." Hank tensed slightly, old fears flickering briefly. "You know my history." "What if no?" Abigail interrupted firmly. "No more what-ifs, no more living in fear of what might happen. We take each day as it comes, grateful for whatever time we have together." Her certainty steadied him as it always did. "You're right," he conceded. "A family would be good." The thought of children with Abigail's green eyes and determined spirit filled him with unexpected longing. Spring turned to summer, summer to fall, and by their first anniversary, the changes in their lives were substantial. The saloon had been sold to Cooper, who had decided to retire from cowboying. Hank and Abigail had purchased land on the edge of town and begun construction on a small hotel, the Kincaid House, as they decided to call it, and Abigail was expecting their first child, due in early spring. The news had filled Hank with both joy and terror. The night she told him, he'd walked for hours along the creek behind their temporary home, wrestling with old ghosts and new fears. When he finally returned, Abigail was waiting up, a knowing look in her eyes. "I was wondering if you'd come back," she said simply. "I'll always come back to you," Hank replied, kneeling before her chair and placing his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "To both of you. I'm scared, Abby, I won't lie about that, but I'm also happier than I ever thought possible." She covered his hand with hers. "That's all I ask, honesty. We'll face whatever comes together." The winter of 1879–1880 was harsh, heavy snows blanketing Tahlequah for weeks at a time. Construction on the hotel slowed but didn't stop entirely. By February, the main structure was complete, though the interior work remained. Abigail, now in her 7th month, supervised the furnishing and decorating with characteristic energy, despite Hank's frequent admonitions to rest. Her belly had grown round and full, a constant source of wonder to Hank, who often woke in the night to place his hand gently on the curve of her abdomen, feeling their child move beneath his palm. On a cold March morning, with snow still deep on the ground, Abigail went into labor. The town doctor was summoned, as was Mrs. Cooper, who had experience as a midwife. Hank paced outside the bedroom for hours, each of Abigail's cries cutting him to the core. "Normal as can be," Mrs. Cooper assured him during one of her brief appearances for fresh water. "She's strong, your wife." Got the spirit of a wildcat. The sun was setting when a new cry filled the house, the lusty wail of a newborn taking its first breath. Moments later, Mrs. Cooper opened the bedroom door, her tired face split by a wide smile. "You have a daughter, Mr. Keller," she announced. "Healthy as can be and with a set of lungs that'll wake the whole county." Hank stood frozen, overwhelmed by emotions he couldn't name. Then the doctor appeared, nodding toward the bedroom. "Your wife's asking for you," he said. "Everything went well. She'll be sore and tired for a while, but she's strong. They both are." On unsteady legs, Hank entered the bedroom. Abigail lay propped against pillows, her face pale but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. She looked up as he approached, her smile weary but triumphant. "Meet your daughter," she said softly. Hank sat carefully on the edge of the bed, gazing in wonder at the tiny face peering from the blankets. Wisps of dark hair covered a perfectly formed head. As he watched, the baby's eyes opened dark blue now, but he suspected they would turn green like her mother's. "She's beautiful," he whispered, reaching out to touch one tiny fist that immediately grabbed his finger with surprising strength. "I thought we might name her Sarah," Abigail suggested gently, "after your first wife, a way of honoring the past while embracing our future." Tears filled Hank's eyes at the gesture. "Sarah Thomas Keller," he agreed, combining the names of both those he had lost. "It's perfect. She's perfect." He leaned down to kiss Abigail's forehead. "Thank you. For what?" she asked, shifting to make room for him beside her on the bed. "For waiting," Hank replied, carefully gathering his wife and daughter in his arms. "For believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. For giving me a second chance at life, at love." Abigail rested her head against his shoulder, their daughter sleeping peacefully between them. "I always knew you were worth waiting for," she murmured. As twilight deepened outside their window, Hank Keller held his family close and silently thanked whatever providence had led him to Tahlequah, and to the woman who had taught him that love, far from being something to fear, was the greatest strength a person could possess. In the years that followed, the Kincaid House became known as one of the finest establishments in the territory. Sarah was joined by two brothers, James and William, and eventually a younger sister they named Hope. Hank continued to help Russell with the ranch operations, though he never again led a cattle drive, preferring to stay close to his family. Abigail managed the hotel with characteristic efficiency and warmth, making it a favorite stopping place for travelers between Fort Smith and Kansas City. Together, They built a life rich in love, friendship, and community, proof that even the most wounded heart could heal when given the chance. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the hotel guests settled for the night, Hank and Abigail would sit on their porch and watch the stars appear over Tahlequah. On one such night, as they approached their 10th anniversary, Hank took his wife's hand and brought it to his lips. "You ever regret it?" he asked. "Proposing to a broken-down cowboy who did his best to push you away?" Abigail laughed softly. "Never for a moment," she assured him. "Though I do occasionally regret not doing it sooner." Hank smiled, drawing her close against the evening chill. "I was thinking about what you said that day, that you'd wait until I didn't fear love anymore." "And," she prompted, looking up at him curiously. "And I realized I don't remember when that fear disappeared," he admitted. "Somewhere along the way, loving you and our children became as natural as breathing." "That's how it should be," Abigail said, resting her head on his shoulder. Above them, a star streaked across the night sky, a brief, brilliant flash of light against the darkness. Like love itself, Hank thought, unexpected, luminous, and completely transformative. "Thank you for waiting," he whispered into her hair. "Always," she replied, a promise renewed with each passing day. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, the sound echoing across the valley that had become their home. Inside the house, their children slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge they were cherished. And on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms, Hank and Abigail Keller watched the night deepen, their hearts as full as the Oklahoma sky was vast.